And what of liberty as the native inhabitants of the New World understood it? Many Europeans saw Indians as embodying freedom. The Iroquois, wrote one colonial official, held such absolute notions of liberty that they allow of no kind of superiority of one over another, and banish all servitude from their territories. But most colonizers quickly concluded that the notion of freedom was alien to Indian societies. Early English and French dictionaries of Indian languages contained no entry for freedom or liberté. Nor, wrote one early trader, did Indians have words to express despotic power, arbitrary kings, oppressed or obedient subjects. Indeed, Europeans considered Indians barbaric in part because they did not appear to live under established governments or fixed laws and had no respect for authority. They are born, live, and die in a liberty without restraint, wrote one religious missionary. In a sense, they were too free, lacking the order and discipline that Europeans considered the hallmarks of civilization. When Giovanni da Verrazzano described the Indians as living in absolute freedom, he did not intend this as a compliment. The familiar modern understanding of freedom as personal independence, often based on ownership of private property, had little meaning in most Indian societies, but Indians certainly had their own ideas of freedom. While the buying and selling of slaves was unknown, small-scale slavery existed in some Indian societies. So too did the idea of personal liberty as the opposite of being held as a slave. Indians would bitterly resent the efforts of some Europeans to reduce them to slavery. Although individuals were expected to think for themselves and did not always have to go along with collective decision-making, Indian men and women judged one another according to their ability to live up to widely understood ideas of appropriate behavior. Far more important than individual autonomy were kinship ties, the ability to follow one's spiritual values, and the well-being and security of one's community. In Indian culture, group autonomy and self-determination, and the mutual obligations that came with a sense of belonging and connectedness, took precedence over individual freedom. Ironically, the coming of Europeans, armed with their own language of liberty, would make freedom a preoccupation of American Indians, as part and parcel of the very process by which they were reduced to dependence on the colonizers.
On the eve of colonization, Europeans held numerous ideas of freedom. Some were as old as the city-states of ancient Greece, others arose during the political struggles of the early modern era. Some laid the foundations for modern conceptions of freedom, others are quite unfamiliar today. Freedom was not a single idea, but a collection of distinct rights and privileges, many enjoyed by only a small portion of the population. One conception common throughout Europe was that freedom was less a political or social status than a moral or spiritual condition. Freedom meant abandoning the life of sin to embrace the teachings of Christ. Where the Spirit of the Lord is, declares the New Testament, there is liberty. In this definition, servitude and freedom were mutually reinforcing, not contradictory states, since those who accepted the teachings of Christ simultaneously became free from sin and servants to God. Christian liberty had no connection to later ideas of religious toleration, a notion that scarcely existed anywhere on the eve of colonization. In the pre-modern world, religion was not simply a matter of spiritual doctrines and practices, but systems of belief that permeated every aspect of people's lives. Religious beliefs were therefore inseparable from what would later be considered secular matters, such as who enjoyed basic rights. A person's religion was closely tied to his or her economic, political, and social position. Every nation in Europe had an established church that decreed what forms of religious worship and belief were acceptable. Dissenters faced persecution by the state as well as condemnation by church authorities. Religious uniformity was thought to be essential to public order. The modern idea that a person's religious beliefs and practices are a matter of private choice, not legal obligation, was almost unknown. The religious wars that racked Europe in the 16th and 17th centuries centered on which religion would predominate in a kingdom or region, not the right of individuals to choose which church in which to worship.
In its secular form, the equating of liberty with devotion to a higher authority suggested that freedom meant obedience to law. Aristotle had described the law as liberty's salvation, not its enemy. The identification of freedom with the rule of law did not, however, mean that all subjects of the crown enjoyed the same degree of freedom. Early modern European societies were extremely hierarchical, with marked gradations of social status ranging from the king and hereditary aristocracy down to the urban and rural poor. Inequality was built into virtually every social relationship. The king claimed to rule by the authority of God. Persons of high rank demanded deference from those below them. Within families, men exercised authority over their wives and children. According to the legal doctrine known as coverture, when a woman married, she surrendered her legal identity, which became covered by that of her husband. She could not own property or sign contracts in her own name, control her wages if she worked, write a separate will, or, except in the rarest of circumstances, go to court seeking a divorce. The husband conducted business and testified in court for the entire family. He had the exclusive right to his wife's company, including domestic labor and sexual relations. Everywhere in Europe, family life depended on male dominance and female submission. Indeed, political writers of the 16th century explicitly compared the king's authority over his subjects with the husband's over his family. Both were ordained by God. To justify this argument, they referred to a passage in the New Testament. As the man is the head of the woman, so is Christ the head of the church. Neither kind of authority could be challenged without threatening the fabric of social order.
In this hierarchical society, liberty came from knowing one's social place and fulfilling the duties appropriate to one's rank. Most men lacked the freedom that came with economic independence. Property qualifications and other restrictions limited the electorate to a minuscule part of the adult male population. The law required strict obedience of employees, and breaches of labor contracts carried criminal penalties. European ideas of freedom still bore the imprint of the Middle Ages, when liberties meant formal, specific privileges such as self-government, exemption from taxation, or the right to practice a particular trade, granted to individuals or groups by contract, royal decree, or purchase. One legal dictionary defined a liberty as a privilege by which men may enjoy some benefit beyond the ordinary subject. Only those who enjoyed the freedom of the city, for example, could engage in certain economic activities. Numerous modern civil liberties did not exist. The law decreed acceptable forms of religious worship. The government regularly suppressed publications it did not like, and criticism of authority could lead to imprisonment. Personal independence was reserved for a small part of the population, and this was one reason why authorities found masterless men, those without regular jobs or otherwise outside the control of their social superiors, so threatening. Nonetheless, every European country that colonized the New World claimed to be spreading freedom, for its own population and for Native Americans.